There's a reason no contact changes everything. And it's not just because you stop talking to them, it's deeper than that. Because when most people think about no contact, they think it's punishment, distance, silence, blocking someone and moving on. But to a narcissist, no contact feels very different. It feels like loss of control. And that's the part almost nobody understands. Because narcissists are not emotionally attached the way healthy people are. They attach through access to your attention, your reactions, your emotional energy, your availability. And the moment that access disappears completely, something starts happening internally. Not sadness, not heartbreak, panic, but here's where people get confused. Because narcissists rarely show panic immediately. In fact, at first, they often look completely fine, sometimes even happier, relieved, confident, like they never cared at all. And that illusion destroys people emotionally. Because while you're struggling through withdrawal, they look untouched. But that's usually because in the beginning, they still believe the connection belongs to them. They believe no contact is temporary, an emotional reaction, a phase. They assume eventually you'll break the silence because historically, you always did. That's why early no contact doesn't always trigger panic immediately. At first, they rely on certainty that they still have emotional access to you, even without speaking. And this next part is where the shift begins. Because eventually, something changes. Days pass, then weeks, then longer, and suddenly, your emotional reactions disappear completely. No indirect posts, no emotional messages, no checking in, no visible emotional attachment. And for the first time, the narcissist loses emotional visibility into you. That's when panic starts building. Because narcissists need emotional feedback constantly. They need signs that they still affect you. Even negative reactions work. Anger works. Pain works. Confusion works. Because emotional reaction means access, and access means control. But no contact removes that feedback loop entirely. Now, they don't know what you feel, what you think, who you're talking to, whether you miss them, whether you're moving on. And uncertainty is extremely destabilizing for narcissists because narcissists depend heavily on emotional predictability. Because predictability is what allows narcissists to feel emotionally powerful. They study patterns constantly. Your reactions, your timing, your emotional weak points. They learn what makes you respond, what makes you soften, what makes you break silence. And over time, they stop relating to the relationship emotionally. They start relating to it strategically. That's why no contact feels so threatening to them. Because suddenly, their emotional map stops working. Now they can't predict your behavior anymore. And when narcissists lose predictability, they lose psychological control over the dynamic. That loss creates something they struggle deeply with, emotional insecurity. But instead of processing insecurity internally, they try to eliminate it externally through access, through reactions, through reconnection attempts. Because if they can get you emotionally engaged again, even briefly, they regain certainty. And certainty immediately reduces the panic no contact creates inside them. They need to know where they stand psychologically. So when you disappear emotionally, they start losing stability around you. And this is where people misunderstand narcissistic behavior again. Because panic in narcissists doesn't always look emotional. Sometimes it looks strategic, calculated, quiet. At first, They observe, watch your social media, check for indirect signals, look for emotional openings, and if they find one, they move carefully. A small reaction, a subtle message, something casual enough to test access without risking rejection. Because narcissists hate direct emotional vulnerability, especially when control feels uncertain. So instead, they test the emotional door first. And your response determines everything. If you react emotionally, the panic calms immediately. Because now they know, I still have access. But if you don't respond, or worse, if you respond neutrally, the panic grows. Because now, the narcissist starts confronting something they rarely tolerate well: loss of influence. And here's what makes no contact so psychologically powerful. It interrupts the cycle of emotional reinforcement. Because narcissistic relationships survive through reaction, not love, not stability, reaction, highs, lows, confusion, relief, emotional intensity. That instability keeps people emotionally attached, but no contact interrupts the emotional rhythm completely. And once the rhythm disappears, the narcissist loses one of their strongest tools: emotional conditioning. That's why no contact often feels unbearable at first. Not because you're making the wrong decision, because your nervous system was conditioned around unpredictability. Your brain became used to emotional chaos, used to waiting for messages, used to emotional relief after pain. And when no contact begins, your system suddenly loses the pattern it adapted to. That's why silence can feel physically painful. But here's what most people don't realize. No contact doesn't just affect you, it affects the narcissist too. Because now, they lose emotional regulation through control. And narcissists regulate themselves through external influence constantly. Attention stabilizes them, access stabilizes them, control stabilizes them. Without those things, internal instability rises quickly. That's why many narcissists suddenly become extremely active during no contact, posting more, showing off more, creating indirect emotional pressure online. Because they're trying to re-establish emotional visibility. They need to feel seen again. They need to know you're watching. And this is where many people accidentally restart the cycle. Because they respond indirectly. They post emotionally. They try to prove they're okay. They monitor constantly. And without realizing it, they reopen emotional access. But true no contact is psychological detachment, not performance, not silent competition, detachment. And that's the phase narcissists struggle with most, because emotionally detached people become unpredictable, and unpredictable people are difficult to control. That's why no contact often escalates narcissistic behavior over time, because eventually the subtle access attempts stop working. Now the narcissist feels urgency, and urgency creates escalation. Suddenly they become softer, kinder, more emotionally expressive. They say things you waited forever to hear. I miss you. I understand now. I've changed. And this part feels incredibly real, because your brain wants relief. It wants closure. It wants to believe the suffering created awareness. But here's the dangerous part. No contact creates emotional scarcity. And emotional scarcity increases the emotional impact of their return. That's why even small messages suddenly feel powerful again. Because silence amplified your emotional sensitivity. And narcissists understand timing extremely well. They know when your guard is exhausted. They know when loneliness starts replacing anger. And that's usually when they reappear. Not always because they deeply miss you emotionally, but because they feel the emotional disconnection becoming permanent. And permanence terrifies narcissists because permanent emotional loss means permanent loss of control. And this next phase reveals the truth about everything. Because if the narcissist regains access even briefly, watch what happens. At first, things feel calmer, more stable, more emotionally mature, but slowly, the old patterns return. The inconsistency, the confusion, the emotional pressure. Because once certainty returns, the mask relaxes again. That's why no contact is so revealing. It exposes whether change is real or reactive. Because reactive change only exists under threat of loss. Real change exists consistently, even without consequences. And narcissists often struggle maintaining emotional consistency. Once control feels secure again. That's why so many people experience the exact same cycle repeatedly. Leave, silence, return, hope, confusion, pain. Repeat. Because narcissistic cycles survived through interrupted closure. You never fully emotionally resolve the connection. You stay psychologically engaged, always analyzing, always wondering, always hoping the next version will be different. And hope is what keeps the emotional door unlocked. But no contact done correctly changes something deeper. It changes your emotional conditioning because over time, your nervous system begins stabilizing. You stop craving emotional chaos. You stop needing validation from them. You stop interpreting silence as abandonment. And that's when narcissists truly begin panicking. And because now they've found us, they feel something they tried very hard to prevent. Replacement of emotional dependence with emotional independence. And emotionally independent people are almost impossible to manipulate long term. That's why no contact threatens narcissists so deeply. Not because they lost a conversation, because they lost emotional influence. And emotional influence is what maintained the entire dynamic. Without influence, the illusion weakens. The confusion weakens. The emotional dependency weakens. And suddenly, you begin seeing things clearly. That clarity changes everything because now, when they message you, you notice the timing. When they disappear, you notice the pattern. When they suddenly become emotional, you notice the urgency behind it. And once you see the pattern, the cycle loses power. Because narcissistic manipulation relies heavily on emotional blindness. It relies on automatic reactions, but awareness interrupts automatic reactions completely. And this next realization is what finally changes your life. No contact was never about punishing them. It was about reconnecting with yourself without their emotional interference. Because narcissistic relationships slowly disconnect people from their own emotional reality. You stop trusting your instincts, your boundaries, your perceptions. Everything becomes centered around managing the narcissist emotionally. But no contact reverses that process. Slowly, quietly, painfully at first. But eventually, you start hearing your own thoughts again, feeling your own emotions again, recognizing your own needs again. And that's exactly why narcissists panic. Because once you reconnect with yourself, their influence weakens dramatically. Now you don't react the same. You don't chase clarity. You don't collapse emotionally during silence. You don't interpret every message as fate. Because now, you see what was really happening the entire time. The relationship wasn't sustained through healthy connection. It was sustained through emotional dependency. And dependency requires access. That's why no contact changes everything. Because once access disappears completely, control starts collapsing. And when control collapses, panic begins. Not because they lost love, because they lost influence over someone who finally stopped emotionally depending on them. And that is what no contact truly threatens most.